Hello and welcome to the Kick in the Creatives podcast, hosted by myself, Sandra Busby, and my fellow creative Tara Roskell, offering you interviews, inspiration, motivation, and a gentle prod in the right direction. And for lots more information, challenges, and other useful tools to help you get creating, you can go to www.kickinthecreatives.com. And of course, this is where you can also find today's show notes. Enjoy the show.
Today we are talking to Will Terry, who's been a freelance illustrator for 23 years. After finishing his BFA project at BYU, he began working for magazines and newspapers not far from where he grew up in Washington, D.C. His early clients include publications such as Time, Money, Wall Street Journal and MasterCard. He has illustrated about 30 children's books for many of the top publishers, including Random House, Scholastic and Penguin. He has created several indie books that have sold tens of thousands of copies. He also co-owns svslearn.com, online illustration classes for children's book illustrators, selling in over 80 countries. We look forward to finding out more.
It's really, really good to have you on, Will. We're really, really grateful for you coming on and talking to us today. You've been highly successful in your career, but I want to go back to when you were at school because you thought that you'd never amount to anything. Can you tell us about your life at school and how you went from having such a low self-esteem to being the success you are today?
Yeah, sure. I actually like talking about this because I've had a lot of students who I feel have gone through the same kind of emotional journey, and I love the idea of helping others with the problems that they're going through. So for me, it was, I just really didn't do well in academics. I think today I would have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. I just I would sit in class and my mind would wander, and the teachers would be giving their lecture. I knew I was going to be tested on it. I knew there was going to be a quiz, and yet I still just couldn't pay attention. And it was really frustrating for my parents because they were both, high academic achievers, master's degree, and my dad working on a PhD at the time. And they just couldn't understand me. And so when I got to college and, here I am, I knew I was, I barely got into college, by the way. And the college that I went to at BYU, there's no way I could get in there today with my GPA. Just no way. Back then, they made some accommodations and I got in there. And then I started to just be really average in my art classes. And that was because I basically, I thought I knew what they wanted, but I wasn't really understanding what they wanted. And so I wasn't able to demonstrate that. I was trying to overachieve in my art classes and my results weren't showing, and they were grading on results, not on effort. And I just couldn't understand that. I couldn't understand why I was just doing so poorly, and they couldn't, there was a portfolio review coming up and I barely got in, and I got let in on probation into the BFA program. And that really lit a fire under me because I thought, okay, I'm not good at anything else. I'm barely good at this art thing. And so I need to work really, really hard. And it was probably the best thing for me to hear at the time, for me to get let in on probation and to have basically, out of 20 students, I was able to see, okay, there's me and another guy on probation. So I'm maybe at the bottom or the second to the bottom, but now I know where my teachers see me. And that was a huge motivator for me to just try to outwork everybody else, because I was like, well, I'm now on the bottom. And after having been a teacher at the university level for almost a decade, I realized that even though it's hard for me to tell people where I see them when I'm critiquing their portfolios or their work, the honesty is the best policy, because when if you sugarcoat something, if you lead someone on, they might not work as hard as they need to.
So can I just ask, like you said, you were on probation.
Yeah.
So how did you improve? Because before you said you couldn't pay attention, you were struggling. So what suddenly made it so you could focus, or what was it you changed?
I started listening to what my teachers were asking for more, um, and realized that a lot of my preconceptions about art and about creating images were wrong. My values were misplaced, and specifically, it's hard to put into words, but basically, I was over illustrating everything. And the essence of good design is refinement, and simplicity. So you think of, if you're, I'm an Apple product guy, so I love the iPhone. But and you can love or hate the iPhone, but Apple really did revolutionize the way that we interact with technology in the touchscreen area, right? So whether you're Android or Apple, the phones basically look and feel the same. And that was really from reducing all these complicated buttons. I remember having some of the first cell phones, and there were buttons everywhere, and you had to memorize what those buttons did. And I thought, this is just a bad system. I have to become an expert on this phone, and then 2 years later, I'm gonna have a totally different phone. And this is I knew it wasn't good design. Then the iPhone came out, where it was, the buttons are reconfigurable for every app that you're in. I'm like, that makes so much more sense. So that was kind of the problem that I was having, was I was overcomplicating all of my art. I was just getting lost in the weeds, and not understanding how to edit out for simplicity, and that's when I really actually started to focus on this thing called design, which it went from being one of my weakest points to one of my strengths, because I realized that drawing is different than design. Design is different than drawing. And I was focused on, just drawing everything and drawing details everywhere, when really I needed to look at the overall picture. And I finally got a few instructors that were able to communicate that to me in a way that really was eye-opening. And that's one of the things that I do when I teach in a college situation, or if I teach for our online school SVS, is that's my emphasis. I feel like that's my little my little area of where I can really contribute, is helping people understand that, yeah, you might have really good drawing skills, but if you don't know how to design the whole image, you're really missing at least half of the picture.
So can you actually remember one piece of work that was a real turning point that you sort of drew and you thought, I'm getting there with that?
Yeah, and it was an illustration for the poem "The Owl and the Pussycat." I don't know if you
Oh,
know
yeah.
that poem. And it was one of the first images that I worked with my instructor, and we designed it. And I have to give him a lot of credit, Richard Hull, who really helped me with the design of that. And but the praise that I got from both the teachers and the students, I was like, and my teachers were like, "You did this," but it was that basically surrendering to the process, and basically trying, being humble and saying, I can't do this alone. I'm going to need help. And going back to the teacher, and the teacher would do a draw over and show me what alterations that he would make, and then I would make some changes, and then go back. And I think we worked on that sketch, back and forth 3 or 4 times before I actually started to refine the drawing, and then finally paint it. And it was my, I call them pinnacle pieces, where you have a piece that you do that's better than all of your other body of work, and it might even be 2 or 3 levels above, and then for the next year or two you struggle to get back up to that level, and then finally you get another breakout piece that's better than that and all the other ones. And yeah, and so that was kind of the turning point for me. I still remember, I still have that painting, and yeah, that was basically the one that gave me the confidence to know that, wow, I can do this. And because I impressed all the students in the class. They're like, wow, you're one of us now.
Speaking of cats, I saw your Kickstarter video, and you were speaking about the cat that couldn't read.
Uh-huh.
And I loved that. I think that whole concept was brilliant. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, it was a failed Kickstarter, so it was really good in that I'm a firm believer that you learn more from your failures than from your successes, and that your
Thank goodness
failures,
for that.
yeah, your failures actually are more valuable, even though at the time you want to die,
Yeah.
but they end up changing your life, and they end up changing the way you think in such profound and positive ways that you're able to do greater things in the future. And I mean, we learn through failure, right? I mean, like that's from day one when we try to learn how to walk. We do something, we fall down, we get hurt, so we feel the pain, and then we say, I don't want to, whatever it was that I just did, I don't want to do that again. And we try something different. And I think we need those wake ups. So what was the original question again?
Well, yeah, I mean, your cat, I was really,
Oh, yeah,
the story of the cat that couldn't read, and that whole thing was really designed, wasn't it, to help children that really didn't like to read and encourage it.
It was, because I was, they call them reluctant readers now. I hated reading. So I was beyond reluctant at the time.
Yeah.
And I love reading today. I actually learned to read and write after school more than in school. I mean, I could read in school, but my comprehension was really low. Now, I really enjoy reading when I get the chance, because I find stuff that I really care about, and it's not, I think that's one of the challenges for school teachers, is to find what their kids are interested in. But the I Hate Reading project was really based on, yeah, like you said, it was about me, and it was about helping kids understand. I wanted teachers and parents who had reluctant readers to see the title and go, oh, my kid needs to read this, because here's a character that hates reading also. So you'll identify with this character right off the bat. Unfortunately, it didn't fund. There's a lot of lessons, and I don't know if we want to go into the details on that, but in a nutshell, it was, people don't buy apps or don't support apps typically on Kickstarter or crowdfunding sites. People have, this perception of apps being free. So I think that was the biggest hurdle that I had, but there was a lot of other little problems that I learned, which actually, again, those failures helped me launch the successful Kickstarter that I did, the second one, which was the little book of superhero characters and pop culture characters.
But moving on to 1997, was it, when you published your first book, Pizza Pat? And it sold over 500,000 copies, and that's what I've read. You must have been really, really surprised by those numbers for a first book. So what was it about that book then that made it so successful, do you think?
I wish I could say that I had a lot to do with the success of that. I think I would make for a better story if I could, if I did. But basically, I think what it was number one, it's one of the readers that they send home. They call them readers in the industry, and they're learn how to read books. So they're the little paperback 24-page books that elementary or primary school children use to learn to read. And one of the reasons why the volume and the numbers are so high on those books is that they sell them through what they call the book club, which is the little pamphlet they send home with kids to give to their parents to order books. And so the teachers are promoting it in their classroom. They're like, okay, so here's, you've got to take this home, show your parents, pick out some books. We want you to read these at home. So it's kind of like the marketing, the publishing world has really infiltrated the schools, and in a good way. I mean, they're like, kids need to learn how to read. I think it's a case where the private sector and the public sector really work well together. So a lot of those books in those series do really well. I think that one did particularly well because it was different. I don't think there was a a little reader about pizza at the time. I think so. But it was fun. It was really fun to work on, and it was I had actually turned that book down two or three times because at that time I didn't identify myself as being a children's book illustrator, and
Right.
and I was making really good money doing advertising illustration and editorial illustration, and it was a substantial pay cut to get the advance to do that book. And so I was looking at it purely monetarily, and then my agent at the time said, she kept telling me these books can actually do really well. Like you can really make up a lot in royalties. And you hear those kinds of stories and you kind of roll your eyes. And but financially, I'm really glad that I took that one because it really paid off.
So when you did that book, I assume you were using acrylic still. You were still working by hand.
Yeah.
So you didn't swap. Was it 2010 you swapped to digital?
Yeah, you guys have done your homework.
So how did you find that transition? Was it quite awkward? And what were you using? What software and how were you working?
Yeah, so I had wanted to switch to digital just because I had known how many people were successfully making the switch, and I knew that it was making their lives easier. And I was using Photoshop on a regular basis to edit my images so I would paint in acrylic, and then I'd get a scan of it, and then I might make a little alteration, or I would just get the scans and do a little color correcting and then send them off to the publisher. So I was familiar with Photoshop enough to know that it would just be easier to start there and finish there. And my prep time for getting paintings ready was like, let's say I was doing a children's book, it would take me a couple days just to get the illustration boards or paper ready to go to paint. So I was like 2 days of just prep work, and maybe 3 even. So I knew that that all that time would go. I would get all that time back if I started working digital. And so I wanted to switch for a long time, but then I didn't know how to do my style. I saw a lot of illustrators that would switch, and I didn't like their digital look. It changed enough to where it was like, I miss your old look. So I didn't want that. So for about 5 years, I was searching for someone to help me make that transfer, and it ended up being one of my former students who actually helped me, who said, I know how to do your style. And I was very skeptical, but there are tools that allow you to treat it's hard to explain in words, but basically with using the texture palette in Photoshop, it allows you to paint on top or in the middle or on the bottom of a texture, if that makes any sense. Like you can dry brush, like that's the technique that I had been using in acrylics is dry brushing with the acrylics. So you basically, after you get your underpainting in and your values and stuff, then as you add the lights to the painting, you're knocking off almost all the paint on your brushes, and you're just basically rubbing the top of the texture. I would create a texture on the paper with a gel medium, and then you just by lightly rubbing, you're just painting on the tops of the texture. And I didn't think that was possible in Photoshop. But anyway, this student helped me understand how to do it and showed me how to do it. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, this is perfect. This is exactly what I wanted. And then the learning curve really was, I wish that I had somebody tell me that the tablet, like the Intuos, like a Wacom tablet. There's a lot of different tablets, but like the most common one is probably the Wacom Intuos tablet versus the Wacom Cintiq monitor, where one you're drawing on the tablet and looking up at your screen, the other one the Cintiq you're drawing on the monitor itself, and you're seeing exactly what you're getting. And I wish someone had told me how much easier it is to draw directly on the monitor. Now the price is very, a lot. It's like 10 times more expensive to get the Cintiq monitor, so price matters. But I spent the first couple years working on that Intuos, and I never felt like I had full control. And if I look at some of the work that I did during those 2 years, it's blurry because I didn't have the control to work the details, because I didn't have the motor control with my hands. So for anyone looking to make a switch, I would say, it's apples and oranges to compare the tablet to the Cintiq monitor, to the actual tablet monitor. And there's good knockoffs. Huion makes some. Unova makes some. They're decent. They're definitely not as good as the Cadillac is the Wacom Cintiq monitor. But as soon as I got the Cintiq, 2 or 3 years after I had been working on the Intuos, there was no learning curve, and I don't think there would have been any learning curve if I had gone directly to the Cintiq, because it's really just like, you're just drawing, you're just drawing and painting right there.
How do you find the Cintiq compared to something like the iPad?
So I actually use the iPad Pro mostly for all of my drawings now, and only because I can take it anywhere. So my method is I'll do all my drawings on the iPad Pro, and then I do all my color in Photoshop on the Cintiq. And I feel really blessed to be able to have that much technology. I know that for students starting out, a lot of them will ask me, like, if you had to choose, which one would you go with, the iPad or the Cintiq? And they both have distinct advantages. I probably would go with the Cintiq with Photoshop, just because it would give me overall like all control, whereas the iPad by itself, I don't feel like you have as much control, and your image file size it's hard sometimes to work on the really huge files on the iPad.
I've only been trying out the iPad quite recently in the last few months, and it's Procreate is the one that I've sort of got my app, and I find it really strange because the pencil it's almost like skating on ice. I don't feel like I have the control that I have on paper. So I was wondering, do you still do the traditional kind of painting as well? Do you have a preference between the two for your own personal work?
So that's a great question. So if I might just address what you were talking about really quickly on the iPad, the slick glass feeling.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people will put a matte cover. They sell covers that you can like a sticky backed cover that you can put on, that's got like more of a toothy paper feel. And I was using those for a while because I had the same issue that you did. But I found that what happens is, after a while, you're drawing you usually draw in the middle. And so whenever your pencil ventures out of the middle of the iPad surface, you get more tooth because you've worn out the middle more.
Yeah.
And that would affect my drawing. And so for me to solve that problem is basically I wear a glove, the glove, and just slide my hand, the butt of my hand, or the heel.
Oh, I see. That's a good idea.
And so it doesn't, because when you anchor the butt of your hand against the side or on the screen itself, it feels so glassy and slippery that it doesn't feel as nice as the resistance you get with paper. But if you're moving you're drawing more from your shoulder, I feel like it doesn't affect you as much. But in my perfect world, the glass would have more tooth to it.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't wear out.
So what is your preference then between the two?
Yeah, so as far as I love painting. I love working with paint. And I love having an original. I've just basically decided that for now, with my illustration work, I'm just going to work digitally because the advantages are too great not to.
Oh.
And I'm not saying that doesn't work for everyone, because so I know artists Jake here, who he does a lot of original work with traditional mediums, just because for him a huge percentage of his income comes from selling the original, and so it's worth any downside to working that way. And I think also there's advantages. I think he probably likes a lot of the happy accidents you get. He probably also, I know he's talked about this before too, the fact that you have to make commitments and you have to be more careful and more precise working traditionally. And I think that might be an area that um, I could, to be honest, that might be an area of my brain that's in atrophy right now, you know, um, because I'm not forcing myself to do that as much. In the future, I see myself going back to paint when I can afford the time, and doing other experiments in that direction because I really do love painting. So just I look at this as kind of a temporary time right now.
You mentioned before that you worked in editorial design and then you switched to children's illustration.
Uh-huh.
So, how and why did you make that switch?
Yeah, so a lot of things were happening at that time. We're talking about mid 90s to late 90s. And so, and looking back, it's easy to get a good picture from above now on all the moving parts. But the illustration world was being affected by, you could say, globalization, the internet, Photoshop, so technology, and then also stock illustration all at the same time. And so what was happening is, um, because of technology, because of the internet and bandwidth, illustrators from all over the world were able to compete in U.S. markets, and U.S. Illustrators were able to compete in foreign markets, where that prior, maybe in the 70s and 80s, it was you had to kind of live in the area that you worked in because you needed to be able to go and meet with your art directors and things like that. You need to be able to go show portfolios and stuff. And then the internet changed all that. At the same time, Photoshop changed that because it allowed art directors to create images, and that ended up saving a lot of magazines. It ended up allowing art directors to spend more of their budget to get higher end illustrators and hire fewer illustrations, because then they would create images in Photoshop to illustrate some of the lesser important articles. And then at the same time, the stock illustration, which is the selling of second rights uh, of illustrations that were already created, um, like stock photography. I think most people listening are probably familiar with those terms. That really took a huge hit in the editorial market. And I began looking and going, I think that this market, and I wasn't alone, but a lot of us were kind of talking and saying, I think this market's going to be threatened greatly in the not too distant future. And it ended up being, 5 to 10 years later, and the editorial market was basically gone. And so I at the same time, my kids were, we were starting our family, we were starting to have kids, and I started to see myself as, oh, I could be a hero at my kid's school because I could illustrate some books. So it was kind of a natural progression that way. And I also made a conscious decision to switch over to children's book illustration because I remember thinking, um, you know, each story is original. The illustrations are original to that story. You'll never be able to sell them for second rights to be used in another story. And so the fact that um, new stories will always be wanted and in demand means that new illustrations will always be wanted and in demand. So yeah, I made that conscious switch, and I'm glad I did. I know a lot of editorial illustrators that aren't illustrating anything today because of that.
Do your kids ever help you with your character building? Do you find that they want to get involved?
I think they've probably helped me more in just channeling their reactions to things. It's interesting because I have friends illustrator friends whose kids are really into illustration, and then there's me, and my kids don't care, don't want to do it at all. And I don't know if that's because I tried to teach them too early. But I felt like I was always encouraging, but they just didn't want to go that direction. And so,
Maybe
um,
one day.
yeah, maybe who knows? I play. My oldest son plays guitar, and he's learned how to play the drums now, and I play the bass, so we play together. That musically, but not. There's no visual artists coming out of my family so far.
So, what's your process then for creating an illustration? Where do you find your inspiration?
Oh man, I really believe strongly that you get your inspiration constantly coming in, and it's from how you're living your life. And so it's basically, if you're staying at home every day and doing the same things, that's going to directly impact your illustration in a negative way, and vice versa. If you are getting out and doing new activities and doing new things and meeting new people and trying to live a full, rich life, that's diverse in many ways, you're going to have um, the memories and the ideas, um, when you need them for illustrating different situations and different topics. And I think having a family is really helpful for that, because you have your subject matter at home. You can see how kids react to things, and your kids help you remember how you reacted to things when you were a kid. They help you bring up those memories that might otherwise be lost.
Do you ever base some of your illustrations on people you've met? Or can't you say?
um, not. I don't think I ever really have directly specific people. I'm sure that again, it's probably an amalgam of just all the different people that I've met, and probably the bigger reason for that is because I haven't really written my own children's books. I've been illustrating others, so the characters that I'm being asked to illustrate usually come with a unique set of circumstances and a unique set of personality traits. However, again, you know, I'm definitely channeling things that I've experienced and people that I've experienced before in creating those characters.
Have you ever had a block where you've run out of inspiration
Um,
or not?
yeah, and there are definitely times where I've 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 created illustrations for a book, and I'm just not happy with them. And I think it's more for me. If I'm not really excited about what I'm working on, I know what I'm working on isn't inspired, and that I need to dig deeper and try again. And there have been times where I've asked my editors if I could have a little bit more time so I can rework some. I'm just not feeling it, and I've even had some of them, one in particular, say, "Well, we like this a lot," and I'm like, I'm just not happy with it. I just want to try again, and because I'm going to have to live with this for the rest of my life. This is the difference between working on editorial magazine work where, it the magazine is in print for a month and then it's forgotten about. And people tend not to really hold on to magazines like they do books. Books could be around for, a lot longer than we can. So you want to make sure you get it right. You want to be proud of it. You don't want to go and do a school visit and cringe every time you see a character that you knew you could have done better on.
So what about your own books, like Gary's Place? You came up with a story for those, didn't you?
I did, yeah. And I guess what I'm talking about specifically is those were self-published, and I'm talking about working more, with a publisher. I got close once to selling a story to Scholastic, and they said they were going to buy it, and then they decided to back out. They thought it was a little too close to another property in the marketplace. But yeah, I do envision myself writing my own books in the future. Would really like to be able to pursue that. And basically the reason that I'm not right now is that I just have enough keeping me busy to work on between um, the children's books that I'm working on, the convention schedule that I have with comic conventions, and then with our online school, sbslearn.com. So I think when one or more of those goes away in the future, like if I get out of one, either selling it or something, then I'll have time to really pursue. Because for me, the problem with writing a children's book and needing to make money from it is a real conflict of interest. It's like, like art to me needs to flow, and it's not like you can put you can't really put a deadline on coming up with a good idea, and refining that good idea. Um, I feel like it's easier to put a deadline on illustration than it is on coming up with the idea for the whole story. And I know some people do work that way, but for me, I'd rather be in a situation where if I sell the story, great. If I don't sell it, it's not going to hurt me financially. So I kind of need to get to a point where I feel like I can just spend time thinking of and working on stories. And quite frankly, I need to spend time um, learning from pros on, how to write a really good story. And we've we've got we've got a woman who did a class for us here at SVS, that just did a great job, and I need to go through her class um, and learn how to write better.
So, what was the inspiration for your books, Gary's Place and Gary's Worms?
Oh, so that was when I was at a time where I was actually in a critique group of other author illustrators, and I was brainstorming every day. I was just when I would go for I was hiking a lot at the time. I would go for a hike for my exercise, and I would just keep a little pad of paper with me, and then when an idea would pop into my head, I would just jot it down on the notebook, and then I'd come home and put them in my computer. And at one time I had about 50 ideas for books, and that just was one of them. I just remember thinking that it would just be a really fun idea if this gopher. I think I even saw a gopher on my hike, and if this gopher, had this labyrinth of exquisite dwelling underneath, and it was basically, I wouldn't say lampooning, but it was a commentary on our lives as our society, where we're a lot of us get caught up in that materialistic society where materialism is never enough. There's never enough stuff. If I have a nice house, I want a bigger house. If I have a big house, I want a huge house. If I have a huge house, I want a mansion. So I was thinking maybe this gopher has the same bug, and just can't stop creating. But because he can dig and build his own house, maybe he just, as soon as he builds one room, he builds another, and all of a sudden he's got this huge thing. And then, of course, in the story, it all gets ruined, as happens to a lot of us. And yeah, at the time that I wrote that, we were going through a financial meltdown after 2008. We were losing our home, like a lot of people over here were.
Mm.
And that had something to do with that story as well. So, yeah, that's why I think, they say, the best stories come from life, come from, where you're writing about your experience. And my experience has definitely crept in to that story.
Would that be what you say makes your personal work different from what you create for a living then? It's more autobiographical.
Yeah, I would say so. I think so. And I think that as far as creating personal work, it's really a chance for an artist to grow and to try to purposely do things that they've never done before. A lot of times with illustration, you're asked to do similar things, and you find yourself kind of ripping yourself off because you're like, well, I already did this sort of thing, so I'll change it up a little bit, but there doesn't really, the excitement isn't really there, or the art direction is you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, and so you end up with a certain amount of frustration. The cool thing about the children's book market is that there is so much freedom that and especially at the higher levels with the major 5 publishers over here in the U.S., and I'm sure there are some in Europe that are like this as well, where they get it and they understand that the author and the illustrator have to be given freedom to create art, and that art isn't created through committees. The lower ends, you tend to have more. You have art directors and editors that with less experience that don't understand this concept, and unfortunately, they become their worst enemy, and how many restrictions they place on you. So creating personal work is a chance to explore who you really are as an artist, and to figure out what you can offer the world. And I have to say, through it's basically through my personal projects that I can go back and look and say, this is all my evolution basically came from trying new things. And I see artists that I've had a few friends that when they would do illustration work, if they weren't actually illustrating for a particular assignment or a job, they would go and do something else. They would never explore and do personal work. And I remember thinking, that's not going to be good for you in the long run. And all of the people that I know that have gone that route, who really haven't explored, they're not working as illustrators anymore. So I think there's a direct correlation to the artists who do personal work and success versus the ones that don't.
Can I just ask you, when you are going to write your next books, do you think you'll continue down the self-publishing route or go down the traditional publishing route? Because I know you've obviously done both.
I like the idea. I really like the idea of self-publishing, because you don't have to write for. So, there are certain things in the publishing world, in the traditional publishing world, that you'll never get published, and they could be very valuable things to certain audiences, and that's simply because those publishers either don't recognize that niche market, or perhaps even politically they don't want to touch that market, or there could be a lot of different reasons why they don't want to publish certain types of books. And people on their own have found success doing that in self-publishing. The problem, obviously, one of the major problems with self-publishing is just how hard it is to get the word out and to get enough people to see it, to be able to find out if it can really gain traction. And so I will probably write for the traditional publishing market in the future, because like I said, if I have the time to do it and I don't need the money, then I think I would probably have a better chance of having a successful book going that direction. But I do, and sadly, the Gary's place, we got a starred review from Kirkus, and I had, so Rick Walton wrote that, but it was my idea. So I basically came up with the whole idea for the story, and then asked Rick to write it, because I knew he would do a better job of actually writing that book. And he liked my idea. And, I told him from the beginning, if you don't like the idea, I don't want you to write it, because you have to fall in love with this story in order to do a good job with it. And he really did. He liked it a lot. And I think that one of the reasons why we got a Kirkus starred review is from the way that he wrote it, because he definitely wrote it differently than I would have. And I think it sounded a lot better than if I had written it. So it's frustrating that we got the highest review you can get, and we got 5-star reviews from 3 of the top children's book app sites, and people just don't buy. They just don't spend money for apps. And a quick little anecdotal story on that was, we were selling at a $2.99 price point. We were selling anywhere from 2 to 5 apps a day, which is nothing, right? In the App Store, Apple App Store. And then we knew of this website called Free App Fridays, and a lot of people encouraged us to do that, and said, you put your app there for a few days and you give it away for free, and then you gain traction. And at that time, the Apple Store recognized downloads, how you appear either towards the top of the list or the bottom of the list. The way they auto curate was, it wasn't through paid downloads, it was just downloads, period. So free was counted the same as paid. And so we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to put it there for free because it kind of went against our, our sensibilities on how to sell. You're there to sell, right? And we'd hired a voice actor. We hired my son did the animation, and so we had some expenses, and we put it on Free App Friday. And the first day we got about 6,000 or 7,000 downloads. So this is going from 2 or 3 or 5 downloads to 6,000 or 7,000. And then the next day it went to 10,000, and then the following day it went to 13 or 14,000, and then it went off. That's the idea, is that then you go off, you get all this volume. We made it to the top of the list of all the children's story apps. We were up on the first page, and then the day that we put it back for sale for $2.99, we got 20 downloads, and then the next day we got 11 downloads, and the next day we got 5 downloads, and then 2. And yeah, so we just didn't make any money. And at the time we were working on the sequel, Gary's Worms, and same thing happened with that one. The writing was kind of on the wall, so it was kind of we finished it anyway, but it was frustrating that we kind of knew we just weren't going to make any money with it. And yet, it got all this really good reviews from Kirkus, which we knew it was a good story. And I think if it had been traditionally published, although it really did, it was one of those stories that kind of relied on the animation, and I was really trying to create something that relied on being viewed on a tablet versus a book. A lot of people were doing books on the computer or books for the iPad. I wanted to do a book that you needed to see the animations to understand the story. And so it would have been hard to do the same project, although I think it could have been done in a story form. And who knows, maybe it'll become a story someday in a storybook. But yeah, it was a frustrating lesson to learn, but it was a good lesson to learn.
So if there's someone listening and they really want to get into illustration, what would be the top tips you would give them?
Ooh, that's a big one. I would say probably the single most important tip I can give is fall in love with the artwork that you're creating, and work to make your art the best it can possibly be. This is going to sound overly simple, but I see one of the big mistakes I see people make is they start down the path of wanting to be a children's book illustrator, and they get their artwork. Let's say you took all the books that are published, professionally published through traditional publishers each year, and you rated them on a scale of 1 to 10, and 1 being elementary or primary school quality, and 10 being the highest illustrator out there. You'd probably find that in that scale, the illustrators that are getting published, the lowest is probably a 7, or maybe even an 8, and then the top is a 10. So there's a high scale to get to, and I'll see illustrators get to a 4 or 5 on that scale, and they spend a lot of time trying to market their work, trying to get the attention of publishers, and they're just not going to. They're just it costs a publisher anywhere from $20,000 to $100,000 to publish a book. I mean, it depends on obviously the publisher and the print run and all that. But I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars to publish a book, and they're just not going to gamble that on someone who doesn't have a portfolio that's proven. So it's futile to spend your time marketing work that isn't gonna be considered. And so the best thing that illustrators can do, I think, is work really hard. Understand that it's a lifelong pursuit. That there's a lot of times we put these goals and these demands on ourselves that we reach a certain amount of success by a certain amount of time. And, for some skills, in some jobs, that might work. For art, I don't think it does because there's too many variables. There's stylistic considerations. There's some art styles require more time learning academic drawing. Some require less, and so there's just too many variables to be able to say by this time I need to have this much success or I'm going to quit. And I see people on social media saying that all the time. If by this time next year I don't have enough commercial success as an illustrator, I'm going to go and do something else. And to me, it's tragic because this is the thing that they love to do. And there are a lot of people who find their first successes in publishing some people find it in their 20s, some people find it in their 30s, some people find it in their 40s, 50s, 60s, probably even 70s. And so, and maybe even 80s. I don't want to exclude anybody out there. but if that's what you want to do, then just work on it. And it doesn't mean that you have to, and some people will say, well, I have to make a living. Well, make a living doing something else, have a day job and work on your passion when you can, and take your time doing it, and eventually you'll get there. It really is a time in thing for most people. There's a direct correlation to the amount of time spent and the quality of work.
And I suppose building a following is huge, isn't it, as well? And I think you've done this very well. And you've also got your YouTube channel, which I've been looking at, and it's great, by the way. Do you find that channel helps you get illustration work? Or do you think it's more about building a following?
I think it's probably more about building a following, but it might have gotten me work. I don't, unfortunately, I don't ask a lot of times and I should be better at this. Sometimes I do ask where people found me. I don't think YouTube is necessarily one of them. However, and the reason that I started the YouTube in the beginning, it wasn't the reason that a lot of people start YouTube channels today. I think I started mine like 7 or 8 years ago. It's been a while. And the reason I did it was actually to make my life easier, because I had a lot of people that were emailing me with questions. And I started seeing the same questions, and I thought, well, this isn't efficient for me to type out this long answer that's the same answer. So if I just put it in video form, put a title on it, then I can send a link next time somebody asks me this question. So it was more a way of creating a video version of FAQs on my website. And then after a while, I started to realize, that it actually could be a marketing tool in some ways. I know that it's gotten me speaking opportunities. So I've spoken at a lot of different conventions and conferences and some colleges and things like that. And I'm sure that it's helped in that regard, because people can see, he can actually talk and, carry a concept for a while. And so, but as far as marketing for illustration work, I don't know that I've gotten much from that.
You mentioned in one of your YouTube videos that you have an illustration agent. Well, I don't know if you still do now, but would you recommend that an aspiring illustrator tries to find an agent, or should they just represent themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as far as, so I have so my current illustration rep is Illozu, Mohammed Danawi, and they've gotten me some really good work in the past. I don't work with them that often, and I think that it's the type of work that I think this is more of the type of clients that they get aren't really the type that want me. Sometimes I turn down work from them just because it's not the right fit, but they've done really well. They do not represent me in the children's book world, because I already had that part of my illustration business going when I got on with them. But as far as giving advice on having a rep or an agent, I think that an illustration rep is not anywhere near as important as it used to be in the past. I think there are probably some illustration reps out there that do really well for their artists. Um, I know of one in particular and I know some artists that they have that they get a lot of work from their rep. Um, I also have a lot of rep horror stories. This is an hour or 2 hour long chat just on reps. But as far as agents go, for literary agents, I think that you could almost make the case that if you're writing children's books, you need to get an agent. I think that is totally different, and the reason for that is that in the publishing industry back in 2008, we went through the recession through 2010, 11. The publishing houses took a huge hit on their revenue, and they laid off a lot of their staff. And so at that time, editors, and I have some friends who are editors who we've talked at great length on this, so I know kind of what happened behind the scenes. And they said, yeah, so right overnight, we were doing the work of 2 or 3 people. And so instead of, they stopped looking at a lot of manuscripts and illustration work on their own, and they started calling up agents and saying, who do you have that could illustrate this, or I'm looking for an illustrator, or I'm looking for a story that has this subject matter. Do you have anything? And so basically the agents became kind of a leg arm of publishing overnight, more than they had been. I mean, they already were fulfilling that role to some degree, but I think even more now. And they haven't hired back the numbers. They've hired some back, but they're not back up to where they were. So I think that the industry now is become used to relying on agents. So I think if you don't have an agent, you're probably hurting yourself if you're writing.
Yeah. You've got a podcast as well, haven't you, called 3 Point Perspective, which, by the way, I really love. And you host that alongside Jake Parker, who we've interviewed before, and Lee White. And I was listening the other day, and you had an episode which was the one where you were all three sharing some of your most embarrassing stories in illustration, and I was chuckling all the way through. I loved it. Can you share one of yours with us today?
Which one do you want me to share? Do you remember
which
one?
Which is the one you find most uncomfortable to talk about?
Oh man, well. So the one that I think is the funniest to me is the one that I had with Arizona Highways magazine, with the tortoise.
Yeah, that one was so funny.
So, and it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of this conversation with the design, and sometimes we draw things and we don't see the big picture. We see we see the details, and we see the little areas of the drawing. And so that's basically what happened to me on this situation. Was I got a call from the Arizona Highways magazine. This was back probably in about 95, 96. And they said, would you like to illustrate this story? It's at the end of the magazine. And it's basically just a lighthearted story about how people will go to the zoo down here in Arizona and volunteer their time and take care of different animals. And so in the story, it mentioned that these helpers, these volunteers, would go into the tortoise cage, and they would wash the turtles. So I guess they get muddy, and they look better in the zoo if their shells are clean. And so they go in there and clean them and take care of them. And in the story, it said that the tortoise actually liked it, and they'd get fed while they were being cleaned and stuff. And so I drew this woman, and it's hard to describe visually, but she's got her arm around the tortoise shell, so you can't see one of her arms, and the other one's kind of holding up the neck. Actually, I'm sorry, she had both hands around the neck. She was kind of giving the tortoise a hug, and just the way that I had drawn it looked a little weird, and so I get this call from the art director, and keep in mind, so the tortoise is holding, or the woman is holding this tortoise, this long neck, coming from her waist because she's crouched down, and the tortoise head and neck is coming right at the viewer, and she's kind of holding on to this thing, and it apparently it looked a little phallic, and so I get this call from the editor, and she says, "Hey, Will, so we got your sketch, and we like it and all, but we were wondering if you could make some changes to it." And I said, "Sure, what do you want me to change?" And she's like, "Well, do you see how, the neck is kind of coming straight at us?" I'm like, "Yeah." "Do you see how it's a little bit awkward?" I'm like, "No, I don't see it, And she's going, "Well, it's the length of it is kind of coming up from her groin area." And it was like all of a sudden, how, in the movie when all of a sudden the image that you're looking at gets bigger, and you hear the rah, rah, rah sound, like I saw it all at once. And then I go, "Oh my gosh." And I was on speakerphone, but I didn't know it. And all the staff was in there because they wanted to hear my reaction to this when I finally saw what they were seeing in it. And it was bad. It was like, if it was an image, if you put it on Facebook and you said, "Hey, everybody on Facebook, what do you think of this?" You'd get destroyed, And so they had a good laugh at my expense, and I turned beet red, and they thought it was so funny, they were just dying laughing. I'm like, "I'm sorry." They're like, "No, we just loved it, like just have to change it a little bit." And like, "Yeah, I'll change it." So
do you teach your students in SBS Learn how to draw, Ted?
I don't.
I'd love to see that picture. Is it published anywhere?
It's not, and I have looked for it, and I haven't been able to find it. Unfortunately, we moved twice since I did that, and there was one point where I really cleaned out my studio and threw away a lot of old art, and I'm pretty sure it got thrown away with that. It's one that I would joyously put it on Facebook today. Tell that story.
As a lesson as well, because I suppose it's true what you're saying. You get so lost in the detail, and sometimes you need to sort of step back and see the whole thing, don't you? But
a
lesson for everyone. Yeah.
Well, I had a student from our online school who sent me an image to critique, and he it's a very similar thing. He had a mother rabbit, and she's squatting down, sitting like rabbits do, and her legs are open. And her 3 little bunny children are facing away from the viewer. She's facing the viewer. The 3 little bunnies are facing her, but their head level is right at her crotch. And it just looks so bad. And he didn't intend anything, but when I looked at it, I was like, so I know you didn't intend this, but this is what it looks like. And he had the same "oh my gosh" moment. He just didn't have it in front of a bunch of art directors. He had it in front of me.
Well, we've had a similar experience. We won't go into too much detail, but in our on our Facebook page, I think somebody had put a sketch that they'd done, and they obviously didn't realise what it looked like. It was a perfectly innocent sketch, but Tara and I could see something completely different. And what we could see, we had to take it down, didn't we, Tara? we didn't tell her, but we thought she obviously she literally had no idea what it looked like. And my husband, I said to my husband, "Paul, is it me? Can you just have a look at this? What is it?" And he just laughed and said, "Well, if you can't see it." I was like, "Yeah, I'm right, I've got to take it down." But poor girl, she had absolutely no idea.
Poor girl, she might know who it is now.
No, it's a long, long time ago.
Now that we're talking about these, my sister, and I have a picture of this. I'll email this to you afterwards because you'll get a kick out of it. But she teaches primary school, and she had a student. It was a Halloween time, and the students were coming in dressed up. And one of the parents made an elaborate costume of a gumball machine. So it turned the little kid into a gumball machine. But the problem was, and his arms were inside, put a coin in, he could give you a gumball through the little slot thing, And she took a picture of of a girl reaching into the slot, but the mom had put the slot right where his groin is. So it's just, it was such it was such an amazing costume. Probably one of the best homemade costumes I've ever seen, but it had a huge design flaw. And it just goes to show, like, we get caught up in the details, and this is everyone. This is our natural way of doing something. And that's why I'm why design is so important to me to teach is we want to start by looking at the big picture and making a master plan before we really start in on those details, or else these unfortunate accidents happen, where it it just ruined the whole costume. And the mom obviously hadn't really envisioned what it would look like. And anyway, I'll send you the picture.
You're obviously inspiring a lot of people out there. So which artists or illustrators have inspired you most, or who do you admire?
I was thinking about that, and the list is so long. I'm going to give you some of the ones that influenced me early on, because the list would be hundreds and hundreds now. And I don't want to name any current ones because I just feel like I'd be leaving too many out. But what really got me started was artists like Lane Smith. And these are children's book illustrators primarily. Lane Smith, Chris Van Allsburg, Steve Johnson. I really, really looked at his work a lot in school. Mary Grand Prix, Gary Kelly, who's primarily an editorial illustrator, but he also illustrated a few children's books. And of course, N.C. Wyeth. I think N.C. Wyeth is underestimated. I think a lot of people think, well, because he was kind of in the beginning of the illustration scene here in the States, that's why he's famous. But his work stands up today. His designs are so solid, and I've actually learned to appreciate his work even more over time. But there's just so many. One thing that I really like is I really am inspired by a lot of different styles that are very different from my own. So it might be surprising for people to know some of the people that I really appreciate because they don't look anything like myself.
So where can our listeners find out a little bit more about you?
I basically have created my website as my hub. So I have links to, everything like my comic book or my comic convention art and my online school and my podcast and my blog or my YouTube channel and everything at willterry.com. So just my name.com, Will Terry. And that's basically where everything is.
Well, we'll link to you on the bottom of our show notes anyway.
Great.
Tara, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit about SVS Learn and what.
Yeah, so we basically all three of us, Lee White and Jake Parker and I, we all had been teaching at universities, and we got to a point where we just decided that we could probably do more and do more of what we wanted if we kind of started doing it online. So we basically focus on children's book illustration, but we also have some comic book stuff, and we want to pursue and do more comic book stuff in the future. A lot of it is general art education, as far as visual art education, like the things that you would find at university, the types of classes you would find at university. Most of them are self-directed. We do have some interactive classes. A lot of those fill up really fast, and so we can't always guarantee space in our interactive classes. But the neat thing about it is it really solves a problem for a lot of people because the price is so much cheaper because we're not accredited. We don't offer degrees. It's really for people who just want to learn and want to get into publishing. And that's what we've really focused it on. And we have classes on basically all the aspects of creating the artwork, to the business side, to running your studio, coming up with ideas, just the whole the whole aspect of being a children's book illustrator or a comic book illustrator. And we love it because it, like I said, it brings the price down. It makes it available for people who don't have a university in their area or can't afford to go to university, or don't have the time and can fit, doing it at their own pace. It's not for everyone in that, some people I think really need the motivation of being in a classroom, a physical classroom setting with other people. So we don't really say that it's an alternative, a complete alternative to college, because it's like comparing apples and oranges. It's very different. A lot of colleges use us as a supplemental material for their students. So it's I don't know. There's a lot of people, a lot of different schools that are coming out doing this sort of thing, and I think technology is great because it's just allowing people to have access to what they didn't have access to just a few years ago.
Well, obviously you are a really busy man with all these things that you've got going on. So we really appreciate that you took so much time to talk to us. So it's been so good of you to come on. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm guessing you're going to have to go and do some illustration now.
I got a few things to get done, but I really appreciate you having me on. And you guys asked really good questions too.
We've loved having you.
Well, thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, perhaps you'd like to share it and leave a review for us on iTunes. Back soon.